It's the summer of 1982, just south of Seattle, Washington. The Green River moves slowly through King County. Quiet, green, unremarkable. People fish along its banks. Families drive past it every day without a second thought. But that August, the river begins to give up secrets. First one discovery, then another, then more. Within weeks, investigators realize they aren't looking at isolated incidents. They're looking at something connected, something someone has been building in plain sight. And here's the part that still unsettles criminal psychology experts decades later. The man responsible wasn't hiding in the shadows. He had a steady job, more than 30 years at the same company. He mowed his lawn, he went to church, he chatted with his neighbors. When investigators later asked people who knew him to describe him, many reached for the same word: ordinary. He was the kind of man your eyes would slide right past in a crowd. And that was exactly the problem, because behind that quiet exterior was one of the most prolific offenders in American history. A man living two completely separate lives. One face for the world, another that no one was allowed to see. For nearly 2 decades, the gap between who he appeared to be and who he actually was stayed hidden. Not because he was a genius, but because the warning signs were scattered across different people, different agencies, different years, until forensic science finally caught up with him. This is the case of Gary Ridgway, the man who became known as the Green River Killer. And in this case explained, we're not here for shock value. We're here to understand something deeper. The criminal psychology behind offender behavior, the manipulation and deception that kept a community in the dark, and the investigation that finally ended it. Because this case forces us to ask an uncomfortable question, one that sits at the heart of victim awareness and crime prevention. How can someone seem completely normal on the outside while hiding something dangerous underneath? And more importantly, what did everyone miss? Let's begin. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. His family later settled near Seattle in the SeaTac area of Washington state, not far from the very stretch of highway that would one day define his case. On paper, the Ridgway household looked like a typical working-class American family. Behind closed doors, the environment was tense and unstable. His parents argued constantly. Loud, frequent, emotionally charged conflict. His mother was described as domineering, a powerful presence in young Gary's life, and one he developed deeply confused feelings about. People who later studied the case noted that he seemed to both crave her approval and quietly resent her authority. That emotional tangle, attachment mixed with anger, is something behavioral analysts pay close attention to, because it can shape how a person relates to others for the rest of their life. There were other struggles. Gary wet the bed well into his teenage years, and the way it was handled at home left him humiliated rather than supported. Now, repeated humiliation in childhood doesn't push anyone toward harmful behavior on its own. Millions of people survive difficult childhoods and grow into kind, healthy adults. But researchers do study how shame, resentment, and powerlessness can accumulate inside a developing mind, especially when there's no healthy outlet for any of it. School wasn't a refuge either. Gary struggled academically. His tested IQ sat in the low 80s, and he had to repeat grades. Classmates saw him as slow. He learned early that he could move through the world unnoticed, and quietly, that became part of who he was. Then came the moment that in hindsight stands out as the first major red flag. At 16, Ridgway lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and attacked him with a knife. The child survived, though the attack was brutal. What chilled investigators decades later was what came after. Ridgway walked away laughing, later admitting he simply wanted to know what it felt like. No remorse, no fear, no consequence that stuck. That incident never properly entered any system. No intervention, no record that followed him. A violent act against a child, and the dots were never connected. As a young adult, Ridgway served in the Navy and spent time overseas during the Vietnam era. He came home, took a job as a truck painter, a job he would hold for over 30 years, and cycled through marriages marked by jealousy and conflict. Outwardly, he even became intensely religious for a time, going door to door, reading the Bible at work, sometimes moved to tears in church. A man of faith on the surface, something very different underneath. The foundation of the double life was already in place. Let's pause the timeline and talk about the criminal psychology here, because this is where the case starts to make a disturbing kind of sense. When forensic psychologists later evaluated Gary Ridgway, they didn't find what most people expect. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't brilliant or charming like fictional offenders in the movies. His intelligence was below average. What he had instead was quieter and far harder to detect. A profound lack of empathy wrapped inside a completely unremarkable exterior. Think of empathy like a smoke alarm for the conscience. For most of us, the moment we imagine hurting someone, that alarm goes off. Guilt, discomfort, fear. In individuals with strong antisocial traits, that alarm is either broken or was never properly installed. They can understand intellectually that something causes pain. They just don't feel it. And that incident at 16, attacking a child simply to know what it felt like, then laughing, is a textbook example of the missing alarm. There's a second concept that matters here: compartmentalization. Picture a house where every room is locked, and the person living there decides exactly which room each visitor gets to see. Church members saw the devout believer room. Neighbors saw the quiet family man room. The dangerous room stayed locked. And because each visitor only ever saw one room, no one realized how different those rooms were from each other. That's the engine behind double-life behavior. The public face isn't an accident, it's a tool. And here's the crucial part. Ridgway didn't maintain it through brilliance. He maintained it because his disguise was boring. Behavioral analysis of cases like this shows that offenders who blend in, who trigger no social alarms, can sometimes operate longer than those with obvious red flags, simply because nobody is looking at them in the first place. We can also see the early roots of control, the confused, resentful relationship with a domineering mother, marriages heavy with jealousy and conflict, a trajectory where power over others, especially women, became tangled with his deepest emotional wounds. Resentment plus absent empathy plus a hunger for control. Each one alone is concerning. Together they're combustible. And in his case, all three showed up early. Key takeaway: dangerous people don't always look dangerous. The most reliable warning sign isn't appearance, charm, or intelligence. It's how a person responds to the suffering of others. Pay attention to cruelty that arrives with no remorse, even in small moments. A missing conscience reveals itself in flashes long before it reveals itself in headlines. Looking back at any major case, investigators find the same painful truth. The warning signs were there, they just weren't connected. Criminologists even have a name for this: linkage blindness, when separate agencies and separate people each hold one piece of the truth, and no one ever puts the pieces on the same table. With Gary Ridgway, the pieces started accumulating early. There was the attack on the child when he was 16, violence without remorse, and no system that flagged him or followed him afterward. That alone should have been a thread someone pulled. It wasn't. Then came his adult relationships. His marriages were marked by jealousy and conflict, and one of his ex-wives later described a moment that, in hindsight, is haunting. He once placed her in a chokehold, seemingly out of nowhere. To her, at the time, it was a frightening incident inside a bad marriage. Isolated, explainable. But behavioral analysts will tell you, aggression inside the home is rarely contained there. It's often the visible edge of something much larger. Ridgway was a known regular along the Pacific Highway South Corridor, an area where vulnerable young women, many involved in survival sex work, were trying to get by. In 1980, a woman reported that he had choked her during an encounter. She survived and told her story. He offered an explanation, claimed she had provoked him, and police accepted it. No charges followed. Then in 1982, The very year the case escalated, he was arrested in a prostitution-related sting. Another brief contact with the system, another release back into the world. And here is where this becomes a story about system failures, not just one man's deception. Each agency, each officer, each ex-wife, each survivor held a single puzzle piece. The choking complaint sat in one file. The marriage history sat in private memory. The teenage attack sat in no file at all. And the women he targeted were women society too often ignored. When reports about them came in, they didn't always receive the urgency they deserved. Ridgway understood this. He later admitted he chose his victims partly because he believed no one would look very hard for them. That's the uncomfortable lesson. Warning signs rarely arrive as one loud alarm. They arrive as scattered notes. A complaint here, an incident there, a frightened spouse, a survivor's report. Separately, each looks minor. Together, they tell a story, but someone has to be positioned to read them together. In the early 1980s, before shared databases, before modern forensic evidence, no one was. And so it kept growing. In July of 1982, the case began in earnest. A 16-year-old girl named Wendy Lee Cofield became the first known victim connected to what investigators would soon call the Green River case. Within weeks, more victims were discovered in or near the river. Deborah Bonner, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, Opal Mills. Young women, daughters, some of them mothers themselves. People with names, families, and futures that mattered. By August 1982, investigators knew they were facing something organized and ongoing. A task force was formed, and the shape of the case began to reveal itself. The victims were overwhelmingly young women in vulnerable circumstances, many involved in sex work or living transient lives along the Pacific Highway South Corridor near SeaTac Airport. This wasn't random. It was selection, a calculated move. Ridgway later explained his thinking with chilling clarity. He targeted these women because they were easy to approach without suspicion, because they would get into a stranger's vehicle, and because he believed their disappearances might not be reported quickly or investigated aggressively. His method relied almost entirely on manufactured trust. He didn't look threatening. He sometimes showed his work ID. He talked about his job, about his son. At times, he even used a photo of his son to appear safe and fatherly. Every detail of his everyday life became a tool of manipulation. The same forgettable quality that made him invisible to investigators made him approachable to victims. The case escalated rapidly. The years 1982 and 1983 were the most intense period. Dozens of young women vanished from the same corridor. Ridgway, by his own later admission, was treating it almost like a routine. He had locations. He had methods of concealment. He returned to certain sites. He even moved some remains across state lines into Oregon, specifically to confuse investigators and break up the geographic picture. This was not a disorganized, impulsive offender. This was planning, concealment, and sustained deception. The behavioral signature of someone protecting a hidden life. Meanwhile, the community lived in fear. Parents warned daughters. The press gave the unknown offender a name, the Green River Killer, and the families of the missing fought to be heard. That's the uncomfortable lesson. Warning signs rarely arrive as one loud alarm. Many later described feeling dismissed, that because of who their daughters were or how they survived, their cases didn't get the attention they deserved. Some of those families refused to stay silent. They organized, they pressured officials, they kept their daughters' names in the news. Their persistence became part of this case's legacy, and a reminder that victim advocacy is often what keeps a difficult investigation alive. And here's the most unsettling part. Ridgway was interviewed by investigators multiple times during these years. He was on their radar. He passed a polygraph in 1984, while by his own later admission being responsible. He gave a saliva sample in 1987, and through all of it he kept showing up to work, kept painting trucks, kept blending in. The danger was hiding inside the routine. and for nearly 2 decades, the routine won. So what was actually driving this behavior? Let's go deeper, because this is where the case becomes a true study in offender psychology. At the center of it was control. Ridgway's inner life, as experts later pieced it together, was built around resentment, especially toward women. The tangled anger he felt toward his domineering mother never resolved. It metastasized. Forensic evaluators noted that his offenses appeared to be, in part, a way of acting out rage and asserting total power over women he viewed as disposable. In his own statements, he described targeting victims with a coldness that stunned even veteran investigators, talking about it almost like a job, a routine, something he was, in his words, good at. That phrase matters psychologically. He wasn't good at much in life. He struggled in school. He was overlooked, mocked, forgotten. But in the hidden world he built, he felt competent, powerful, in control. For an ego starved of status, the secret life became the one place he felt like he mattered. Behavioral analysts see this repeatedly. When someone feels powerless in their visible life, a hidden life of domination can become intoxicating. Then there's emotional detachment. Ridgway demonstrated an almost total absence of empathy. He later confessed to so many offenses that he literally lost count, confusing victims, forgetting names. To him, they had stopped being people. Psychologists call this dehumanization, and it's the mechanism that allows someone to cause harm repeatedly without the conscience ever engaging. And holding it all together, compartmentalization at an extreme level. The church-going truck painter and the offender along the highway were, in his mind, sealed off from each other. He could clock in the morning after an offense. He could comfort his wife, raise his son, plan a weekend barbecue. The public face wasn't slipping because, in a sense, he fully inhabited it. Each life had its own room, and the doors stayed locked. This is what makes double-life offenders so difficult to detect. The disguise isn't a performance they struggle to maintain. It's a parallel identity they genuinely live in. Key takeaway: when evaluating people, watch for the gap, the space between the public image and the private behavior. Most of us are roughly the same person in every room. When someone's private conduct, especially toward vulnerable people, sharply contradicts their public face, that gap itself is the warning sign. Hidden routines, controlling behavior, and a dismissive attitude toward lesser people are signals worth taking seriously. Welcome to Section 7, the investigation of the Green River killer case. The Green River investigation became one of the largest and longest-running cases in American history, and the story of how it was finally solved is a masterclass in persistence and forensic evidence. In 1982, the King County Sheriff's Office formed the Green River Task Force. At its peak, dozens of investigators worked the case full-time. They built timelines for the investigation. They interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They collected an enormous volume of physical evidence from scenes scattered across wooded areas, ravines and riverbanks. A young detective named Dave Reichert was among the first assigned to the Green River Task Force, and the case would follow him for the rest of his career. Investigators even consulted Ted Bundy, who was then on death row, for insight into how this type of offender might think. Bundy offered a chilling and ultimately accurate observation. The offender was likely returning to the locations where victims had been left. Ridgway entered the picture early. He was a known customer along the Pacific Highway corridor. In 1983, a witness connection placed him on the radar in the disappearance of Marie Malvar. Her boyfriend even led police toward Ridgway's house. He was questioned by the detectives. In 1984, he took a polygraph and passed. That moment is now taught as a cautionary lesson in investigative training for detectives worldwide. Polygraphs measure stress responses, not truth, and an emotionally detached individual can defeat one. But in 1987, investigators did something that would quietly decide the entire case. Acting on a search warrant, they collected hair and saliva samples from Ridgway. At its time, DNA science wasn't advanced enough to use them. The samples went into evidence storage, a small envelope holding the future of the case. Years passed, and the task force eventually shrank as the leads dried up. To the public, the case went cold. Families waited, and some never stopped pushing, calling detectives and refusing to let their daughters be forgotten. A handful of investigators matched that persistence, working leads long after the headlines faded. Then technology caught up with the case. By 2001, advances in DNA analysis were starting to emerge. Newer methods capable of working with tiny, degraded samples allowed scientists to revisit the preserved evidence. Detective Tom Jensen submitted the decades-old samples for testing. The results changed everything for the investigation and the victims' families. Ridgway's DNA matched biological evidence recovered from victims dating back to 1982 and 1983. The DNA results included Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, and Carol Ann Christensen, the saliva sample he had casually given 14 years earlier. Probably believing it meant nothing, it became the key that unlocked the entire case. And forensic science added one more layer: microscopic spheres of spray paint. Consistent with the specialized paint used at the Kenworth truck plant where Ridgway worked, the spray paint was recovered in connection with several victims. His ordinary job, the cornerstone of his harmless image, had left a forensic signature behind. The lesson investigators drew from this is now standard practice nationwide. Always preserve everything. Evidence that can't speak today may testify tomorrow. Welcome to Section 8, The Capture. After 19 years, the moment finally came for Gary Ridgway. November 30th, 2001. After 19 years, the moment finally came, and it came quietly, just like the man himself. He had painted trucks for over 30 years. Gary Ridgway was leaving the Kenworth truck plant in Renton, Washington, at the end of an ordinary workday. The same plant where he had painted trucks for over 30 years. The same routine that had shielded him for 2 decades. Detectives were waiting. He was arrested in connection with 4 victims: Opal Mills, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen. These were the cases where the forensic evidence was strongest. His co-workers were stunned. Many had worked beside him for years. Some had even jokingly called him Green River Gary, never imagining the nickname was literally true. His wife, Judith, was devastated and disbelieving. By every account, she had no idea. She described their marriage as happy. That's how complete the compartmentalization was. The person who shared his home never saw the locked room. When investigators sat across from Ridgway, they encountered the same flat, unremarkable man witnesses had always described. There was no dramatic confession at first. He denied everything, but the case no longer depended on his cooperation. The DNA match was statistically overwhelming, and the paint evidence tied his specific workplace to multiple scenes. Then, in 2003, the case took its final turn. Facing trial and the near certainty of a death sentence, Ridgway's defense team approached prosecutors with an offer. He would confess fully in exchange for his life. What followed was one of the most extraordinary interrogation processes ever recorded in criminal history. For months, Ridgway sat with detectives day after day, walking through his hidden life. He led teams to undiscovered remains, finally bringing answers to families who had waited 20 years. Finally bringing answers to families who had waited 20 years. And the scale of what he admitted exceeded anything he had been charged with. He ultimately confessed to taking the lives of more victims than any convicted offender in American history. The community's reaction was a complicated mix of relief and renewed grief, and one haunting question echoing everywhere. He was right there the whole time. How did no one see it? Welcome to Section 9, The Trial and Outcome. After decades of investigation, Gary Ridgway finally faced the justice system. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway stood in a King County courtroom and pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. At the time, the most ever attributed to a single offender in U.S. legal history. Years later, in 2011, A 49th conviction was added when the remains of Rebecca Marrero were finally identified. There was no dramatic trial, no jury. The case was resolved through a plea agreement, and that agreement remains one of the most debated decisions in modern justice system history. Here was the prosecution's dilemma. They had rock-solid forensic evidence in a handful of cases, but dozens of other families had no answers at all. No recovery, no confirmation, no closure. Prosecutor Norm Mailing had long opposed bargaining away the death penalty, but he ultimately concluded that the truth for the many outweighed maximum punishment on the few provable counts. In exchange for a full confession and cooperation in locating remains, Ridgway would be spared execution. Some families supported the deal. It gave them the truth and the chance to finally lay their loved ones to rest. Others felt it let him escape the consequence he deserved. Both reactions are deeply understandable. That tension, truth versus punishment, is a real and painful trade-off the justice system sometimes faces. And this case is now studied in law schools precisely because of it. The sentencing hearing in December 2003 produced one of the most powerful courtroom scenes ever recorded. One by one, family members addressed Ridgway directly. Many expressed anger and grief. He sat expressionless through nearly all of it. Then an elderly man named Robert Rule, the father of 16-year-old victim Linda Rule, stepped forward. He told Ridgway that what he had done made forgiveness hard. And then he said that because of his faith, he forgave him anyway. And Gary Ridgway, the man who had sat unmoved through decades of devastation, broke down and wept. It was virtually the only visible emotion he showed. Psychologists still discuss that moment. Rage and grief never reached him. Unexpected mercy did. Judge Richard Jones sentenced Ridgway to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional time for tampering with evidence, telling him that the compassion the community had shown was something he had never once extended to his victims. Ridgway was sent to the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. Ridgway was sent to the Washington State Penitentiary, where he remains today. A man who will never again see the outside of a prison wall. So what does the Green River case actually teach us? Strip away the headlines, and this becomes one of the most important case studies in criminal psychology. Strip away the headlines, and this becomes one of the most important case studies in criminal psychology, because almost everything about it contradicts our instincts. We expect danger to look dangerous. Ridgway looked boring. We expect deception to require brilliance. His IQ was below average. We expect a hidden life to eventually crack under pressure. His held for 19 years. Through interviews, a polygraph, even a workplace nickname that pointed straight at him. What protected him wasn't genius. It was three forces working together. First, his ordinariness. The steady worker, the churchgoer, the family man. It functioned like camouflage. People don't investigate what they don't notice. Second, his choice of victims. He deliberately targeted women society was already overlooking, and society tragically cooperated. When reports about missing young women in vulnerable circumstances didn't generate urgency, the silence gave him room to continue. This is perhaps the hardest lesson of the case. A hidden danger survives only as long as a community's attention has blind spots. Victim awareness isn't just compassion, it's crime prevention. Every person deserves to be searched for with the same urgency, no matter how they lived. Third, system failures. The teenage attack that entered no record. The 1980 choking complaint that was explained away. The 1982 arrest. The 1983 witness lead. The past polygraph. Each piece sat in a different drawer. Modern investigations now rely on shared databases, behavioral analysis units, and cross-agency communication precisely because of cases like this one. Cases where the dots existed, but the lines were never drawn. And yet, this case also shows what eventually works: persistence, preserved forensic evidence, and families who refuse to give up. A saliva sample stored in 1987, useless at the time, solved the case in 2001. Detectives who wouldn't quit and parents who wouldn't stop calling gave dozens of families answers. Science, patience, and careful evidence handling succeeded where instinct had failed for 2 decades. 3 takeaways to carry with you. 1. Public image is not proof of private character. Judge people by how they treat the vulnerable, not by how they appear. 2. Warning signs matter most when they form a pattern. One incident can be explained away. A pattern never should be. 3. Preserved evidence and persistent investigation can change everything, even decades later. The victims of this case were daughters, sisters, and mothers who deserved to be seen long before they were lost. The most meaningful way to honor them is to learn what their case revealed about deception, about blind spots, and about paying attention to the people around us. If this case helped you understand criminal psychology, warning signs, offender behavior, or how investigations work, subscribe to Criminal Psychology Files for more educational case studies.